What you're about to witness isn't just politics. It's a masterclass in dignity under fire. In the grand halls of the International Conference Center in Abuja, Nigeria's capital, a confrontation took place that would echo far beyond its walls. The stage was set for a routine African Union economic summit. But what unfolded was anything but ordinary. President Adeokunbo of Nigeria, a seasoned statesman, sought to use the platform to assert dominance. What he didn't expect was a quiet but unshakable response from one of Africa's youngest leaders, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The theme of the summit was unity through prosperity, an African renaissance. But beneath the formalities, old power dynamics simmered. Nigeria, with its vast oil reserves, sprawling population, and military might, had long positioned itself as the gatekeeper of West African politics. President Adeokunbo, now in his third decade of rule, carried that legacy like a badge of honor. He was charismatic, cunning, and ruthlessly articulate. Known for his booming laugh and commanding presence, he used public appearances as political theater, often at the expense of his rivals. Ibrahim Traoré, by contrast, entered the hall with little fanfare. At 34, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso was a stark contrast to the aging African elite. No lavish entourage, no dramatic gestures, just a composed presence, clad in a modest brown suit, and the kind of calm that unsettles those used to chaos. Delegates murmured as he took a seat in the third row, away from the main stage reserved for legacy leaders. He seemed unbothered, focused solely on proceedings. The opening ceremony played out as expected, anthems, prayers, and economic projections. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. President Adeokunbo stepped to the podium, his bodice shimmering under the bright lights. With well-practiced ease, he spoke of Africa's destiny, Nigeria's leadership, and the importance of seasoned governance. But as his speech wore on, his tone shifted. Without warning, Adeokunbo veered off script. "You know, my friends," he said, a wry smile playing on his lips, "sometimes I see these young leaders on TV, making bold proclamations. I ask myself, where were they when we were negotiating peace, building institutions, facing down the IMF? Leadership," he paused, letting the word linger, "is not a social media campaign." The room tensed. Cameras adjusted. Producers leaned in. Everyone knew who he was talking about. Take our young friend from Burkina Faso. Adeokunbo continued, gesturing subtly. "Captain Traoré, or should I say, President Traoré? How does one prepare for such responsibility? Through military coups? Instagram posts about sovereignty?" The laughter that followed was strained, uncertain. For the first time, Traoré shifted in his seat, not defensively, but with quiet resolve. The air grew thick. Delegates glanced at one another, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. It was a diplomatic ambush on live television. Then came the silence. Traoré rose. He didn't walk to the podium. He simply stood, hands clasped, and addressed the room. "Mr. President," he began, his voice firm but even, "you asked where we were when institutions were being built. We were the children your generation left behind when those institutions failed. We were the ones studying by candlelight, walking miles to school, and watching our parents bury dignity beneath poverty." The hall froze. We inherited broken promises, not legacy. What we lacked in title, we made up for in truth. And what we lacked in experience, we gained through survival. The young leader's words were deliberate, each syllable carved from a place of conviction. "Leadership," he continued, "is not about the age of your bones. It's about the weight of your integrity. You speak of patience. We have waited. But patience cannot be an excuse for stagnation, nor can experience be a shield for arrogance." Gasps rippled through the hall. Cameras zoomed in. Social media lit up. You mock revolution, but it was revolution that brought down apartheid. Revolution that gave birth to our independence. Revolution that demands we stop managing poverty and start building prosperity. Adeokunbo's smirk faded. Traoré went on. "You ask what qualifies someone to lead. I answer, conviction, courage, and commitment to the people, not proximity to power, not time served in palaces. The people I serve don't care how many decades I've governed. They care whether their children eat, whether their homes have light. He paused, scanning the room. So yes, I'm young, but youth is not a weakness. It's a warning. That time is up for those who believe leadership is a throne to be inherited rather than a trust to be earned. A hush fell over the conference. Then, slowly, applause began. From the back, then the sides, then a standing ovation. President Adito Kunbo stood still, his posture rigid. Whatever point he had tried to make had been drowned out by something he hadn't anticipated: respect. And just like that, a quiet revolution was televised. Ibrahim Traoré sat down, hands folded once again. But everything had changed. Established systems. President Adito Kunbo leaned closer to the microphone, his voice lowered into a confidential tone that somehow made his next words feel even more piercing. How long, he said, does Captain Traoré expect to hold power before his people realize they need real leadership? The kind that understands the complex art of governance, the necessity of compromise, and the ability to work within international systems rather than criticize them from the margins. The question lingered in the air like smoke. Camera operators tightened their zooms on Ibrahim Traoré's face, hunting for any flicker of discomfort. Social media editors stood ready to hit publish, and journalists in the press section typed like the fate of their careers depended on every keystroke. But Traoré did not flinch. Instead, he stood. The motion was so calm, so deliberate, that for a few seconds the audience didn't quite process it. No visible anger, no dramatic gesture, just a quiet assertion of presence. He smoothed his jacket with one hand and began walking forward, step by measured step. I believe, he said, his voice rising effortlessly above the ambient noise, that President Adito Kunbo has asked a direct question. It would be disrespectful not to provide a direct answer. The murmur of whispered speculation spread like wildfire. There was no precedent for this, no section on the agenda, no prepared remarks. But no one stopped him. Everyone knew they were witnessing something that reached beyond protocol. Adito Kunbo tried to recover the upper hand, stepped aside with a forced smile. Of course, my young colleague. Please enlighten us. Traoré stepped to the microphone, adjusted it once, and gazed out across the room. Thank you, Mr. President, he began, voice steady as stone. You've questioned my qualifications to lead. You've implied that age and experience are essential to leadership. These are valid concerns, and they deserve real answers. He paused, not for drama, but to gather his next words like an artisan sharpening a tool. But before I answer, allow me to pose a question of my own. His eyes met Adito Kunbo's. When you speak of experience, whose experience matters? When you talk about preserving institutions, whose institutions are you protecting? And when you describe governance as complex, complex for whom? Now, it was clear this would not be a defense. It would be a reframing of the very foundation of African leadership. You suggest leadership must come from decades within old systems. But I say this, some systems are not worth preserving. Some institutions were never designed to serve our people. And some experiences, particularly those of tolerating injustice, may disqualify more than they qualify. The room held its breath. You ask how long I expect to remain in power, he said. But I ask, how long should any leader remain if his people continue to suffer? How many decades of experience do you need before you notice that children are dying from diseases we know how to prevent, that our youth would rather risk drowning in foreign seas and stay in the land of their birth? Now his voice carried the moral authority of lived truth. You mock soldiers, Mr. President. You say we don't understand complexity. But let's remember, our history was written by soldier leaders who knew sometimes systems must be broken before they can be rebuilt. He looked straight ahead now, addressing not just the audience but the millions watching online. Patrice Lumumba was too young, they said, too radical. So was Thomas Sankara. So was Mandela when he chose resistance over passivity. But these men were not judged by age. They were judged by justice, by sacrifice, by impact. He inhaled deeply. I am qualified to lead, he declared, because I buried children murdered by terror while governments debated budgets. I've slept in powerless villages while presidents sat in palaces. I've held the hands of mothers explaining why they'd rather die crossing deserts than stay here. His voice now cut with conviction. Leadership isn't about appeasing international partners who profit from our poverty. It's not about guarding colonial institutions built to extract our wealth. It's not about using age and status as shields from accountability. Several delegates shifted in their seats, while others leaned forward, riveted. You want to talk about institutions? Traoré asked. Then let's talk. The World Bank has trapped us in debt. The IMF forces austerity that hurts the poor. The UN Security Council doesn't have a single permanent African member. The AU talks unity while member states practice division. ECOWAS? Silent through displacement, conflict, disaster. His rhetorical fire gained momentum. These are the systems I'm expected to respect. But what have they delivered for the average African? What prosperity? What dignity? What future? Now he turned back to Adato Kunbo. You lead Nigeria, a country of vast resources and brilliant minds. And yet, under your watch, it has become the poverty capital of the world. You import 80% of your essentials despite the ability to feed a continent. Your youth flee by the thousands. Your industries stall. Your people suffer. The room was frozen. The insult was brutal, but the facts were undeniable. So, when you question my qualifications, allow me to question yours. What qualifies a man to stay in power when his nation declines? What wisdom is it that watches suffering grow year after year and remains unmoved? Adato Kunbo now stared coldly, his face tightened into a mask. Traoré wasn't done. You criticize my military background. Yes, I'm a soldier. I took power through force. I did not win an election. I did not inherit power. I did not rise through parties loyal to donors or dynasties. But I accepted the call because my people had no more time to wait. His tone softened, and I served not to reign but to rebuild. There was no applause. Not yet. Just a moment of stillness, so complete it felt sacred. Traoré stepped back on the podium, nodded once, and returned to his seat with the same quiet authority that had defined his every step. By traditional standards, I'm exactly the kind of leader the African Union warns against. A soldier, a revolutionary, a disruptor. Traoré paused, letting that image settle. But I asked this room, and every citizen watching, what is the difference between removing a corrupt regime through force and allowing to stay through fraudulent elections, media control, and constitutional loopholes that erase term limits? The room was silent, not out of politeness, but recognition. In Burkina Faso, we didn't take power because we craved it. We took it because no one else would. While our people were being slaughtered by terrorists, our so-called leaders were dining with foreign dignitaries who saw us as nothing more than a source of uranium and gold. Our youth were unemployed, our lands pillaged by multinational corporations, and our future mortgaged for the comfort of a few. Traoré's voice deepened, not with anger, but with undeniable conviction. We stepped in because someone had to, because polite meetings and diplomatic excuses were costing us lives, because compromise had become another word for surrender. He turned toward Adato Kunbo again. You asked me how long I expect to stay in power. But that's the wrong question. The question should be, how long will it take us to build institutions that serve our people, not our colonizers? How long will it take to build an economy for Africans, not for shareholders in foreign capitals? How long until dignity is no longer a dream, but a reality? Then, to the full assembly, if it takes 5 years, I'll lead for 5 years. If 10, then 10. But I seek not permanent rule. I seek permanent change. Scattered applause followed, some supportive, some wary, but the temperature of the room had shifted. The conversation had changed. President Adato Kunbo speaks of complexity, of diplomacy, of global nuance. But I argue, our problems are not complicated. They are deliberately perpetuated. And the answers are not beyond us. They are feared by those who profit from our failure. He raised one finger. And the CFA franc and control our own currencies. 2. Renegotiate natural resource contracts so African people, not corporations, benefit. 3. Invest in schools and hospitals, not imported weapons. 4. Forge trade deals that serve African unity, not foreign interests. 5. Stop borrowing from institutions that poison our budgets with austerity. 6. Stop attending summits where we are seated as beggars, not partners. 7. Stop pretending poverty is our natural state, instead of a byproduct of policy and power. By now, the press section was ablaze with typing, cameras fixed on him. Even the most skeptical delegates were leaning in. These are not abstract theories, Traoré said. These are political choices. And they don't require age. They require courage. Alexander the Great conquered empires before 30. Joan of Arc led armies at 19. Che Guevara was 28 when he shook Latin America. Dr. King was 26 during Montgomery. Mandela was 26 when he co-founded the ANC Youth League. He smiled faintly. Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's son, was 33 when he transformed our nation, and 39 when he was killed for daring to think independently. So when President Addo asks about my age, I know what he means. Youth and inexperience are code words. What he fears is independence. What he resents is urgency. What he dismisses as immaturity is simply my refusal to wait quietly for change that never comes. Traoré returned to the podium, both hands gripping its sides. Let me be clear. I am not here to attack President Addo personally, nor to diminish Nigeria, a brother to Burkina Faso. Its success is our success. Its pain is our pain. I recognize the burdens he has carried. I acknowledge the difficulties of his tenure. But I question whether the methods that have failed for decades will suddenly work now. If only we give them more time. He surveyed the room. Africa is the youngest continent on Earth. Over 60% of our people are under 25. They are not inspired by complexity. They are not moved by diplomatic finesse. They want results. They want jobs, clinics, schools, safety, and dignity. And they want it now. These young Africans do not care about your international portfolio. They do not revere your institutional resume. They care whether you deliver. And if you don't, they will leave, they will revolt, or they will replace you. Now Traoré spoke to the cameras. To the young people of Africa, you do not need to wait. You do not need permission to rise. You do not need to inherit broken systems. You can build new ones. Your anger is not a flaw. It is power. Use it wisely. This time, the applause erupted, not hesitant, but authentic. Delegates clapped. Journalists stood. The room had changed. But Traoré wasn't finished. President Addo asked, "How long do you expect to rule before your people demand real leadership?" Let me answer plainly. I will serve only as long as my people believe I serve them, not myself. The day they doubt that, they must remove me through elections, through protest, or, if necessary, the same kind of uprising that placed me here. Gasps rippled through the chamber. No sitting president says that, but Traoré meant every word. Real leadership is not about staying in power. It is about standing accountable, not to tradition, not to foreign approval, but to your people and your results. He stepped away from the mic, ready to close. I came here prepared to collaborate, to plan Africa's next chapter. I did not come to defend my age or to justify my revolution. But if this is a conversation we must have, if we must debate whether longevity matters more than urgency or whether systems matter more than people, then so be it. I am ready. He turned once more toward Addo, and I hope, for Africa's sake, you are too.
Rigid in his chair, President Addo face was a mask of barely restrained anger. Yet Traoré remained composed. "I hope, President Addo," he said steadily, "that despite our differences, we can work together in pursuit of African unity and progress. Perhaps our contrasting views on leadership can one day complement each other. But I also hope you understand why some of us believe that the era of business as usual must come to an end." With that, he stepped away from the podium, relaxed but dignified. "Thank you for your attention. And thank you, President Addo, for giving me the opportunity to speak honestly." The response was instantaneous. The hall exploded in a storm of applause. Some delegates stood, clapping with unmistakable admiration. Others sat stunned in silence, struggling to process the speech that had just been delivered. In the press section, journalists scrambled for their phones, calling editors, uploading footage, and declaring, "You're not going to believe what just happened." President Adetokunbo remained seated. For several moments, he didn't move, seemingly paralyzed. When he finally rose and made his way back to the podium, his steps lacked the usual certainty. The polished statesman from earlier was gone, replaced by a man visibly shaken. "Well," he said, forcing a tight smile that no one believed, "our young colleague certainly has passion. And as we all know, passion can be a valuable quality in politics." But his words rang hollow. Defensive. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. Traoré, whom many had expected to crumble under pressure, had instead ignited a spark. His speech didn't just defend, it inspired. It didn't retreat, it confronted. And more than anything, it resonated. Throughout the rest of the summit, the effects were unmistakable. Delegates who had barely acknowledged Traoré before were now approaching him during breaks, eager to shake his hand, ask questions, and speak candidly. Staff members from various African delegations asked to take selfies. Older diplomats, once dismissive, now found excuses to introduce themselves. Meanwhile, Adetokunbo's circle began to shrink. The laughter and warmth that had followed him earlier were gone, replaced by tepid, formal exchanges. Some private meetings he'd scheduled were quietly cancelled or postponed. But perhaps the clearest sign of the seismic shift came during the lunch recess. Traoré sat at a long table, surrounded by leaders from smaller nations. They were deep in animated discussion, on sovereignty, monetary independence, youth mobilization. Adetokunbo, at a distant table with his usual allies, now found conversation hard to come by. The vibrancy that once followed him had migrated to the other end of the hall. A journalist from BBC Africa, observing it all, would later write, "In just 20 minutes, Ibrahim Traoré shifted the gravitational center of African political discourse." Though the summit technically continued for 2 more days, everyone knew the defining moment had already occurred. And the true aftershock came not in that hall, but online. Within hours, clips of Traoré's speech went viral. On TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, his words spread like wildfire. Hashtags like #TraorSpeaks and #AbujaMoment trended across the continent. Millions of Africans, particularly the youth, shared snippets of his speech alongside captions like, "Finally, someone said it," and "This is the leadership we've been waiting for." University students organized live viewings of the full address. Discussion panels popped up across campuses. And it wasn't just the youth. Older citizens, many long disillusioned with politics, found themselves deeply moved. Parents shared the video with their children, calling it a lesson in courage. International media jumped on the story. CNN ran a feature titled, "The Young Voice Shaking African Politics." BBC aired a documentary exploring the generational rift in African leadership, centering the summit as a pivotal moment. Al Jazeera hosted heated debates about the future of African governance, with scholars, journalists, and leaders weighing in. Many began referring to what had happened as the Abuja turning point. Perhaps the most striking ripple came from Nigeria itself. Despite the government's efforts to minimize the incident, the video flooded Nigerian social media. Young Nigerians especially embraced Traoré's criticisms. They reposted charts on unemployment, emigration, and poverty, echoing his points, backing them with data, and saying, "He's right." Initially, Nigerian officials tried to downplay it. "A young man's emotional oversimplification," the foreign minister said. "He lacks a mature understanding of the region's complexities." But this strategy backfired. The dismissive remarks only fueled more outrage. The video kept trending. Commentaries multiplied. Memes exploded. Then, a joint statement from over 30 Nigerian civil society groups landed like a bombshell. President Traoré voiced what millions of Nigerians feel but seldom hear from their own leaders. His questions deserve answers, not dismissals. International observers quickly realized that this wasn't just a viral moment. It was an ideological clash that had been building for years. For decades, post-independence leaders had relied on compromise, slow diplomacy, and loyalty to international frameworks. But now, they were being challenged by a younger generation that demanded results, justice, and dignity. As a political analyst wrote in Foreign Affairs, this was not merely a confrontation between two presidents. It was a confrontation between two visions of Africa's future. The months that followed confirmed that something had truly shifted. Traoré's profile soared. He received speaking invitations from universities, global policy forums, think tanks, and grassroots movements. Young African leaders, emboldened by his stance, began speaking with greater clarity and fire. Meanwhile, Adetokunbo's influence began to wane. Regionally, other West African nations that once fell in line behind Nigeria now asserted their own agendas. Negotiations on trade and development became tougher. Several long-standing agreements were reopened. But the most transformative change was cultural. Across Africa, especially among youth, the conversation shifted. Traoré's themes, monetary independence, resource control, continental unity, became rallying cries. Activists organized town halls, marches, digital campaigns around his core message: we deserve more, and we can demand it. The exchange in Abuja wasn't just a political moment. It became a symbol of rising consciousness. One widely shared social media post captured the feeling perfectly. President Traoré didn't just respond to an insult. He responded to decades of silence, compromise, and injustice. And for the first time in a long time, millions of us felt heard. Ironically, Adetokunbo's attempt to humiliate Traoré had done the opposite. It elevated him. It handed him a microphone he used not to defend himself, but to challenge an entire generation of complacency. And the echoes of that moment continued to reverberate, reshaping the future of African leadership one voice at a time. Meanwhile, across the African continent, the video continued to spark conversations that far outpaced the initial confrontation. University lecturers added the exchange to their political science syllabi. Clerics quoted Traoré in sermons about moral responsibility and fearless truth-telling. Artists began sketching murals and crafting spoken-word performances based on what they now called a turning point in African political discourse. Not all the responses were favorable, of course. Among Africa's older political class, there was visible unease. Behind closed doors, presidents and ministers criticized what they called Traoré's reckless populism and dangerous theatrics. This may excite Twitter, one West African leader muttered in a leaked conversation, but it does nothing for governance. Still, their critiques betrayed more discomfort than conviction. What they failed to see, or pretended not to see, was that Traoré's words weren't impulsive grandstanding. They were a meticulous, calculated dismantling of the very assumptions that had allowed Africa's immense promise to remain unfulfilled. The most profound validation of Traoré's message didn't come from diplomats or analysts. It came from ordinary Africans who recognized their own struggles in his speech. Market vendors in Lagos passed the clip between them while lamenting rising food prices. University students in Accra formed new clubs to debate African independence and youth governance. In rural Kenya, farmers gathered around solar-charged phones to watch a young leader who, for once, seemed to understand their pain. One viral response came from a group of Nigerian youth who had been planning to migrate to Europe. In a heartfelt video, they admitted that Traoré's speech had made them pause. "He made us realize the problem isn't Africa," said one young engineer. "It's leadership that has normalized failure. Maybe instead of running away, we should stay, and fight for the Africa we believe in." The economic ripple effects weren't far behind. International investors, sensing the growing scrutiny of Nigeria's leadership, quietly postponed deals. Multinational firms became wary of potential policy shifts driven by this new wave of assertive leadership. More significantly, the economic community of West African states, long dominated by Nigerian influence, began to fracture. Smaller nations, emboldened by Traoré's challenge, pushed for trade reforms that prioritized regional equity over legacy power. The CFA-Franc debate, reignited by Traoré's call for monetary sovereignty, took on new life. For the first time in decades, Francophone nations openly questioned their currency arrangements with France. In Paris, policymakers watched nervously as anti-colonial sentiment surged, this time, not through street protests, but from presidential podiums. But the deepest and most lasting shift was cultural. Across Africa, young people began to see themselves not as spectators of politics, but as rightful participants. University applications in political science departments surged. Youth wings of political parties expanded dramatically. Hashtags like #AfricaCanLead and #NewVoicesNewAfrica trended for weeks, transforming into grassroots campaigns. Many who had once dismissed politics as corrupt beyond redemption began to believe again. Outside the continent, the African diaspora took notice too. In cities across Europe and North America, Africans organized discussion panels and networking events around Traoré's message. For some, it stirred thoughts of returning home, not as victims of circumstance, but as contributors to transformation. For others, it redefined what it meant to be African abroad, assertive, confident, and unashamed of a continent long misrepresented. Elite academic institutions responded quickly. Harvard's Kennedy School invited Traoré for a guest lecture titled Leadership in the Global South. Oxford's African Studies Center hosted a symposium on post-colonial governance, using the Abuja confrontation as a case study. The Brookings Institution published a landmark paper on the Traoré Doctrine and its impact on 21st-century African diplomacy. Yet perhaps the clearest sign of the exchange's impact was found not in the enthusiasm it generated, but in the silence it imposed on its fiercest critic. President Adato Kunbo, once flamboyant and media-savvy, appeared less frequently. His charisma, so potent before, seemed to have lost its audience. His press conferences became defensive, often hijacked by questions about youth unemployment, brain drain, and international dependence. Even events designed to highlight Nigeria's achievements turned into platforms for responding to Traoré's accusations. At the next African Union summit, Adato Kunbo cut a diminished figure. His booming voice had softened. His customary humor felt forced. And in one particularly telling moment, a junior delegate from Malawi respectfully challenged one of his remarks, citing Traoré. Meanwhile, the Burkinabe leader's influence was rising exponentially. Young African politicians began mirroring his rhetorical style, firm, respectful, truth-driven. Phrases like, "We must stop asking for permission to govern ourselves," echoed in parliamentary speeches from Lusaka to Monrovia. The slogan, "African Solutions for African Problems," was no longer a cliché, it was a rallying cry. Mining deals came under review across the continent. Resource contracts were renegotiated. Aid packages once accepted without question were scrutinized for their political cost. And in boardrooms from Beijing to Brussels, partners realized they now had to deal with African leaders who were no longer afraid to say no. There was backlash, of course. Some Western institutions tried to dismiss the new wave of African assertiveness as naive populism. Others warned of economic instability. Behind the scenes, efforts were made to isolate those who adopted the Traoré line. But the tide had turned. Across Africa, people weren't asking if change was possible. They were asking, how soon? More than anything, the exchange in Abuja had shattered a long-standing myth, that challenging power was political suicide. Traoré had proven the opposite. By speaking plainly, passionately, and without apology, he had gained credibility far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Perhaps the most meaningful shift was psychological. For decades, many Africans had viewed politics as something done to them, not for them. Traoré's speech had modeled a new relationship between citizens and leaders, built on transparency, honesty, and urgency. It had reminded a generation that leadership is not about age, but courage. Not about credentials, but conviction. The video didn't fade. It kept circulating, pushed by algorithms, yes, but more powerfully by people who saw themselves in it. In classrooms, it became a case study in civic engagement. In homes, it sparked intergenerational conversations. In churches and mosques, it framed sermons about hope, justice, and responsibility. Above all, it showed that an African leader could speak with dignity and clarity on the global stage, without needing permission, translation, or foreign approval. It proved that truth, when spoken boldly, travels farther than strategy. And so, what had begun as a tactical attempt to embarrass a younger, less qualified leader ended up triggering a movement. The confrontation intended to expose Traoré's weaknesses had instead revealed Adetokunbo's limitations, and the exhaustion of an entire generation's excuses. In trying to belittle a rival, Adetokunbo had given him a platform. And on that platform, Traoré didn't just speak. He redefined the conversation.